Like thinking about restaurant cooking, people are not cooking from scratch to finish for your order for every recipe. We are prepping things in advance, like say blanching and shocking vegetables so that once we go to saute them to order, they take a minute or two. They don't take the 20 minutes that the carrot might need. So these are strategies that professional cooks use too. It's just looks and feels different at home. And I think that sometimes our notion of how to have something fresh at home sort of gets in the way of us being as efficient and effective as possible.
You're listening to the Plant-Based Diet Podcast, where we talk about all things plant-based. I'm Esther Garfin, the host of this show and founder of Alternative Food Network. Join me and my amazing array of guests who are a mix of healthcare professionals, industry executives, and people with an interesting story to tell about their plant-based journey. Let us help you with your journey, wherever you're at, to learn the what, why, and how to eat plant-based. It's good to be back. Welcome to season 5 of the show. I really never imagined that I would be hosting a podcast, let alone it running for this long. But you guys seem to want it, and since I'm a proponent of plant-based eating, we'll just keep going on this journey together. This episode is being released in January, which is, of course, New Year's resolution time. If one of your New Year's resolutions is trying to eat healthier and incorporating more plant foods into your diet, this episode is going to help you kick it off and will also give you tips on how to be successful with it. And who better to help than a plant-based chef? I'm joined by Dr. Chef Stephanie White, who is currently the Director of Education at Auguste Escoffier School of Culinary Arts, and she also helped develop their plant-based programs. She holds a Bachelor of Professional Studies in Culinary Arts Management from the Culinary Institute of America, a Master of Arts in Food Studies from New York University, and a Doctorate in Higher Education Leadership from Maryville University. Now, before we get going, I wanted to let you know that Culinary Medicine Recipe, which is another series produced by Alternative Food Network, which is the same company that produces this show, is currently starting its second season. It's hosted by triple board certified physician Dr. Sabrina Falquier, and she's combined her passion for medicine and food to become a culinary medicine expert. Culinary medicine is a fairly new evidence-based field of medicine that blends the art of food and cooking with the science of medicine to prevent and treat disease. To quote one of her fans, Dr. Falquier has a fantastic scope across both the kitchen and in health, which allows her to reach many demographics with great comfort. I invite you to tune in to Culinary Medicine Recipe on your favorite podcast listening platform or on the Alternative Food Network website, which is alternativefoodnetwork.com. And now let's get started with the first episode of Season 5. Welcome to the show, Dr. Chef Stephanie. So nice to have you.
It's so nice to be here. I'm so excited.
It's always fun to have a chef on the show. I don't have many chefs, but when I do, I really think it's a great addition to the show because it helps people put into practice a lot of what we talk about on the show, which is plant-based eating. And then they get to hear from a chef and maybe get some ideas for recipes and things like that. So I always love having a chef on the show.
Awesome. Well, I'm happy to help with the applicability and how to make it happen. It's one of the best things about being a chef.
Awesome. And speaking of you being a chef, how did you get into this whole area?
Yeah, it's always a good question to think about. I think we can all probably think about how did I get to where I am to begin with. So how I ended up in the hospitality industry, now in culinary education. Growing up, I was very into food. It was my way of connecting with other people. I enjoyed baking. Growing up, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and we had these raspberry bushes where we would harvest them and sell bushels of them in the quart containers and stuff like that. So I sort of fell in love with the food production side and seeing like fresh, vibrant raspberries, like in the peak of the sun where it's kind of warm and it glistens in your hand. I don't know. It was just really beautiful as a kid. And I love that I was able to do something with my hands and then be able to nourish and provide it to somebody else. So that's really where it started. How I then ended up in the industry, it sort of meandered over time. When I was in high school, I started really critically analyzing the food system. It's one of the reasons why I went to study ecology. And for me, it really led me down a path towards veganism because of where the American food system was. I felt like it was the best way, especially as a teenager with a limited ability to make any food choices myself, to have some sort of control in what I was able to buy into, essentially. So that's really where it started for me. It's twisted and meandered a lot of different ways. I worked in high volume cookery. I worked at a yoga institute and retreat center in west of Massachusetts. I worked in the wine industry in Germany. So I kind of went around, did my tour, got a master's in food studies, and then throughout this time, I really worked a fair amount with teaching kitchens. So when I was in my undergraduate at the Culinary Institute of America, we had this feasibility pilot study looking at health and wellness principles, and that was a collaboration with the Sam Wiley Institute and Harvard's Public School of Health. So I sort of fell in love with teaching during that pilot study, and being able to see other people really learn to love food through health. So that always stuck with me. And then when I was finishing my master's, I was working for some other company, and I got this call saying, hey, there's a teaching kitchen on an organic farm in Cincinnati, Ohio. They're part of this teaching kitchen collaborative. Would you want to be the chef there? And it was like everything was sort of aligning. It made total sense. Nobody else kind of questioned as soon as I told them why I was moving to Ohio from the East Coast about that life decision. So that's really where I started being much more in the education space. I was at Turner Farm for quite a number of years, and we did a lot of work with the University of Cincinnati as well. And then I transitioned to Escoffier, which is a really amazing online education. We also have two campuses, one in Boulder, Colorado, and one in Austin, Texas. But I work in the online space. I started as a faculty member and then sort of moved up through administration as I was working on my doctorate. So I think that's probably the short way I can explain how I ended up in this space.
And you created, at Escoffier, you created their plant-based programs?
Correct. So they already were developing it once I got involved, but I really helped to develop the recipes and the content and curricula for it. So they sort of had this scaffold of how they wanted the program to come together, and I had the really amazing opportunity to help write a lot of the content for it. And then once we sort of had all of this content developed, I helped actually record a lot of we have these recipe videos for students. So they're cooking in their own homes, which is a really amazing way for them to get a culinary education without having to move states or totally upheave their life in the process. But the way that we're able to have professionally done demonstrations for them is by having them recorded in a filming studio. So I got to do a large bulk of our plant-based recipe videos. And then as a sort of a mid-level administrator, I oversaw that program specifically for quite a while. We also have a holistic nutrition and wellness program that I was overseeing. So they're very near and dear to my heart.
Wow, that's amazing. And for the audience who's listening, and given that it's the beginning of our 5th season, we might have some new listeners. Can you help them understand, when you say plant-based versus vegan, let's say,
right?
What does plant-based mean to you?
That's an awesome question. I think it's one that continues to evolve. For me, plant-based is much broader than if somebody were to say, I'm vegan. Veganism is plant-based. However, it's not the only way to be plant-based. So when I think about what being plant-based is it's predominantly whole foods that are plant-based in origin. So you can still consume animal products following a plant-based diet. However, it's much heavier on plants, and I like to see it as something where you minimize the amount of processed food as well. But obviously, there are a lot of variations on that. Like when some people say, I'm whole food plant-based, many of them may not do a lot of seed oils or other ingredients like that. So it sort of depends on who you're asking to define plant-based. But for me, it's much more focused on how do we make plants taste delicious, along with grains and legumes and really beautiful products, spices and herbs, and things that like really make dishes sing beyond sort of our, especially in America and North America in general, the like meat-centric focus we've had as a society for a long time. So it's sort of changing that narrative of what's the center of the plate.
Okay, and now I want to talk about the person who's just starting out, and also for, let's say, someone who's been, trying to eat more plant-based foods for a while, how to keep them successful at it. So let's start with, it's January, let's say New Year's resolution. Yeah. You want to
We're going plant-based.
Yeah, we're going plant-based. What would you suggest to them?
I know this sometimes can sound trite, but start small is such an important element to any lifestyle changes. So when we're thinking about plant-based cooking, you can think about what dishes do you already like? What do you like making on a daily basis? What's in your repertoire already? What are you confident cooking? From there, thinking about, okay, so how can we either change the ratio of what's in this dish so it's more plant heavy, or how can we start adding whole grains, or how can we add in additional fruits and vegetables that may otherwise not be there? So starting with what you're already confident in and then finding small tweaks, I find is much more sustainable than being like, we're going to throw everything out of the pantry. We're starting from scratch. That works for some people, but generally speaking, when we're thinking about behavioral changes, that is not a sustainable behavior. So I would say start small, find little things that you feel comfortable changing or adding or tweaking, and then from there build on that. So maybe set a goal every week to try a new vegetable, or to change the portions of how many whole grains or legumes that you're consuming in the week in comparison to some of the other items you might be consuming. That's really where I would start, especially if it's somebody who's never done this before but really wants to get into it. It can feel really overwhelming really quickly, and that can lead to a lot of people being like, well, screw it, I'm not doing it. And that's not the point. None of us are perfect. And I think that giving ourselves grace in that process as well to try things, even if you're not hitting your goal 100% every single week, thinking about what worked really well, maybe some hurdles that you had, how can you approach them in the future? That way you're continuously evolving and practicing and gaining confidence.
And even if you're starting small, as you suggested, can you give some examples of maybe basic staples that someone should have in their pantry or in their fridge or wherever?
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about, we'll start with the pantry first. So a lot of things that can be really helpful to make a wide variety of dishes. So you're not like, I know this one dish and I'm only going to eat chickpeas. I love chickpeas, but they get old, just like any other food if you're consuming it on a daily basis. So finding different varieties of, I like dried beans because they're more economically friendly than canned. That being said, it takes longer to soak them and then cook them. So canned is totally cool still. I tend to also recommend trying to do low or no sodium if you're going to go the canned route for beans. But those are really great staples because you can puree them into different types of hummuses or make them into a sauce, or you can use them in a braise, you can roast them, you can do so many different things with them, and they're shelf stable, which is awesome. I also really love lentils, which is one of the reasons why I shared a lentil soup recipe, because they cook so fast. Unlike other legumes, you don't have to pre-soak them. There are plenty of different types of legumes as well. We've got brown, green, red, think about the different dulls that are out there as well. So you can really play with the flavors that you're using with legumes. So I think lentils tend to be quite forgiving, especially if you're using it in a soup application. I find that sometimes if you're cooking them like brown lentils into a salad, fabulous and lovely and an excellent way to incorporate them. But for somebody who may not be confident or comfortable cooking lentils just yet, you may accidentally overcook them. So when you put them in a soup, it's very forgiving because you can't really overcook it. So it's a really nice way to start off. Other sort of pantry items, so thinking about whole grains, mostly everybody probably has rice, but branching out in the types of rice that you have, going from white rice can be totally fine, but thinking about brown rice can be a really great way to add additional fiber and minerals, and it can be a very simple switch that can be beneficial, but also thinking about other grains and how they can bring different flavors and textures. So quinoa and farro and barley, there's just so many different options. So I wouldn't say go to the store, buy them all. Start with a few and start introducing them, see how you like them. And then from there, thinking about like what should be in a fridge. The fridge is going to look different for everybody. I will say like condiments like Dijon mustard or other things like that can be really helpful when you're making different dishes because they're pretty stable and they're going to complement a lot of flavor profiles. But thinking about different veggies, I really like to cook in the season or seasonal cooking, which is going to look different for probably all of our listeners, depending on where they're listening to this at any given
everywhere.
time. Exactly, which is amazing. So when we think about seasonal cooking, what's seasonal in Toronto in January versus what's seasonal in California in January is going to look totally different. And so trying to figure out what's locally available can be a really nice way to stock fresh items. But I also really love toting frozen produce because it's picked at its peak, which means that it's not, with some fresh produce that's distributed halfway across the world, it's spent a lot of time, and in that process, nutrients start breaking down, so it's not as fresh. But when you buy frozen, even if it's out of season, it's fresh and it was picked when it was in season, so that can be a really nice economically friendly option, and it makes it so that if you're in the middle of the winter and in a place that's not conducive to a lot of growing during the winter, you're not just relegated to root vegetables. Although I love root vegetables, they're fabulous and delightful and super complex, and there's a lot of them, so you can have fun with it. But I think we all have that seasonal fluctuation where at some point we're like, man, I miss asparagus, or man, I miss those strawberries. And I think that's the key thing, is finding little tricks like frozen items that can help create more variety, but also kind of honoring the seasons.
Yeah, and frozen's economical as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when it comes to the fresh, seasonal fresh, how would one know? I mean, we kind of know what's seasonal, but maybe there's someone out there who just doesn't know what is a seasonal vegetable in their area. Are there any resources or anything where they could, before they go into the supermarket, they just go, oh, okay, yeah, I should be looking for this because it's seasonal. It's just going to taste better.
Right. Yeah. No, that's an excellent question, because I think, especially if you're not exposed to it, how could you know with our globalized food system? Because we go to the grocery store and there's zucchini in January, even if you're in a northern state or in Canada or anywhere in the world where that's just not in season. But we have it available, which is a blessing and a curse with our food system. So one resource that I really love is seasonalfoodguide.org. They have an entire platform that you can basically plug in where you are, what month or like beginning or end of the month it is. I will say that like it just gives a general viewpoint of what may be seasonal in your area at that time. That being said, what is going to be available locally in your area can depend on microclimates. It can depend on your local growers. And like I live pretty close to Cincinnati. I'm in northern Kentucky, and we have a lot of really cool local farms that use really great growing methods to extend seasons. So there are a lot of farms that actually do have lettuce in January in the area. It's local, it's fresh, but it's been grown in a hoop house, so it stays warm. So we have it available, but you wouldn't otherwise expect it.
Where did you say it was grown? In a what house?
A hoop house.
Like a greenhouse?
Yeah, it's like a greenhouse. Yeah. So basically it helps trap in the heat so that it creates the environment where, because otherwise if you just grew lettuce outside your house in the snow, that's not going to last very long. So there are different ways that also indoor farming and vertical farming, aquaculture, aeroponics, there's a lot of different ways to grow food locally that then extends or changes the notion of what's in season. So the seasonal food guide is a really great just overview of like what's generally available in my area. From there, what I tend to recommend is get a little curious and find out if you have any local markets in your area, because that's a really great way to just see like what's available at a farmer's market, because that is going to be local predominantly. And you get an opportunity to talk to farmers who can tell you about how they're growing it or what's going to be in season next month. And you build a relationship and a network, but also build your knowledge. So tons of online resources, but I do also think even though we live in a very digital era, there's definitely something to be said about connecting to the people that are around you in your community.
Okay. And since we're talking so much about vegetables, do you have a favorite way of preparing vegetables?
Oh, also seasonally driven. So like thinking about the winter, I really love doing braises and roasts because it's a really awesome way. Thinking about like root vegetables, when you roast them, it brings out some of that natural sweetness that's in them. So I know beets can be very divisive for some folks because they can be quite earthy, but there's golden beets, there's Chioggia beets. There's tons of different types of beets, which it can also change the flavor profiles of them. But when you roast them, they just naturally get sweeter from the residual sugars that are in them. So it can kind of become like candy in a way. I mean, I wouldn't eat it as dessert, although you can totally use beets in dessert. Not relegating that, but generally speaking, it's a really awesome way to prepare them. You can do it in large batches, so it makes a lot of sense for meal prepping. I think that's another strategy, especially if you're new to plant-based or trying to get into it, figuring out how you can prep in large batches so that you're not continuously making things from scratch every single day, because unless you really love to cook and you have a lot of time, that can become cumbersome as well. So finding ways to, say, roast beets, then you could do the beets in a salad, or you could actually puree some and make a spread for sandwiches. You can do a bunch with that. So I would say during the winter, I really love roasting produce, but during the summer, I like a lot more raw applications or even pickling things, because then you get the nice bright acidic crunch to it. So it just depends. But I would say right now, especially with colds, I'm going roasting.
Okay. So you mentioned batch cooking, and I would imagine that's a great way to keep someone successfully eating plant-based, because you're trying to save time in the kitchen as well. Do you have any other tips about, once people have started, what can keep them going and being successful with plant-based eating?
Yeah, so similar to batch cooking, thinking about how you can strategically use your ingredients for multiple different dishes. So not just making like, I'm going to meal prep the same thing Monday through Friday. Some people love that. I will say that I get bored of the same thing pretty quickly. So what I like to do is prepare food items, so say those beets, or say I do a big batch of rice. I don't incorporate other ingredients just yet until I go to finalize my dish. That way, say for the example of the rice, I could use that as a component for dinner, maybe with some, I don't know, roasted tofu with chimichurri sauce and some veggies. But then if I have more rice that I have prepped, I could use it to make fried rice one day. If I didn't add any spices to it, I could even turn it into rice pudding if I had leftover rice that I was like, I just got to use this now. So when you prep in batches, like pretty much straightforward ingredients, you can use them in a lot of different ways. Some folks will call that prepping over, which essentially is sort of like leftovers, but intentional. So that is definitely something that can be really advantageous, particularly if you're trying to make this sustainable, but you don't want to be in the kitchen every day, or like be in the kitchen, but just, to finish things, to heat things up. That can be a really lovely application. The other thing that I love to do, which is batch cooking, but if you do want to make an actual meal, so say our lentil soup, you make a big batch, but then you can freeze it into smaller portions so that as you're going throughout a season, you can pull it out in small batches. So you're not like, I got to eat a gallon of soup. What am I going to do? And not that that's necessarily a bad predicament, but it can be a boring predicament. So I find that if you freeze in smaller portions, it becomes much easier, especially if it's like you had a really long day, you didn't get to the prep that you wanted to do. If you have something in your freezer that you can pull out pretty quickly, it can be a really great way to stay consistent with whatever your goals are, but not feel like you have to like suck it up and start cooking,
Yeah.
So while soups are great for freezing, you can do other things like casserole dishes and things like that freeze really well. There's a lot of things that freeze pretty well. You can even freeze whole grains once they're cooked. Sometimes I'll do that with quinoa, so I'll cook it and then put it on a sheet tray to cool down rapidly. That way you don't accidentally overcook your quinoa. But once it's cool, you can put it into, if you like doing glass containers, you can. Otherwise, like plastic airtight containers, you can lay them flat, and then you can kind of stack them in your freezer. That way, if you're putting together a dish and you really want to grain really quickly, but you don't want to cook it from scratch, you've got it in the freezer, you just heat it up, and then it's part of it. So I would say that can be a really effective way to help keep going without it feeling like a burden constantly.
I'm always amazed, every now and again I meet someone who does not like to freeze things and does not like leftovers. And I'm like,
Right.
They're the best things ever.
I love both. But that's one of the reasons why with like leftovers, I try to be very explain that you can be strategic about it. So it's not just like, oh, I'm reheating the same thing over again. It's like, no, you can use those elements for other things. So you give it a new life. It's no longer a leftover. It is just something that you prepped in advance. Like thinking about restaurant cooking, people are not cooking from scratch to finish for your order for every recipe. We are prepping things in advance, like say blanching and shocking vegetables so that once we go to saute them to order, they take a minute or two. They don't take the 20 minutes that the carrot might need. So these are strategies that professional cooks use too. It's just looks and feels different at home. And I think that sometimes our notion of like how to have something fresh at home sort of gets in the way of us being as efficient and effective as possible.
Ooh, that was a little behind the scenes restaurant behind the scenes there.
Yeah.
That's great. You mentioned the lentil soup and that you had provided us with a recipe. And for those of you who are listening and are wondering where this lentil soup is, it's going to be in our monthly newsletter for January. So if you are not already signed up to our newsletter, you can go on alternativefoodnetwork.com and sign up for the newsletter there. I'll put a link in the show notes as well, but that's where you will find Stephanie's lentil soup. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, vegetables need to be organic.
It's a really great question. I think it's one that plagues a lot of people. And it's an important question because organic growing can be really beneficial to our soil, but also to what we're consuming. I like to reference the Environmental Working Group's Dirty Dozen. They also have a separate list called the Clean 15, which essentially what they do is a lot of research and looking at the residual pesticides that may be on specific food items or crops. So they curate this list every single year based on the data that they're gathering. And essentially that Dirty Dozen is the vegetables or produce, because there's also fruit on the list, so I'm going to say produce, that may have the highest sort of concentration or residual pesticides on them. So I would say going organic can be really beneficial for those 12. Beyond that, organic growing, it's a good thing to support. That being said, it's not always the most economically friendly for everyone, and I think that's where some people might feel defeated as like, I can't buy everything organic, so I can't do this. When really, that Dirty Dozen is a good tool. That being said, when we're thinking about local growers, that can be an awesome way to connect with farmers locally because not all farms have organic licensing. It's expensive, but many other farmers, especially smaller farmers, may use those principles or something even better than what the standards are, but they're not able to use the label because they haven't bought into the whole certification process. So I tend to recommend, like, if you don't have the capacity to start researching local farms and figuring that out, I would say focus on the Dirty Dozen. Beyond that, though, there are a lot of amazing opportunities for produce that are not specifically organic, and that is okay. But that is sort of a good area of opportunity for folks if they do want to consume organic, but may have price considerations. I think most of us have to consider price on pretty much everything these days.
And everything keeps going up.
Exactly. And, it is sort of just a reality right now. So I would say if you really want to buy into organic, I would go for the Dirty Dozen. Beyond that, if you do have the time, start just chatting up some local farmers to see what their growing practices are. Many of them do also have websites these days. It's not like farms are totally not online. Just sometimes not all websites will have it. But farmers love to talk about how they grow their food. So it's not a hard conversation to have. There are also, depending on where you live, different types of food co-ops that may aggregate. So it's kind of like farmers markets, but some of them will even have online distribution. And sometimes they are also really great at finding out how people are growing in your area and sort of if you feel confident and good about those growing practices. Because organic can be great, not just for our health, but like I said before, our soil health, which is incredibly important then for the nutrient density of our veggies now, but also in 50 years. So it's an important thing for us to consider, but there are different ways for us to approach it beyond just looking for a label.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the end for this episode, but I do want to ask you, if someone is interested in finding you, where should they do that?
That's an excellent question. So if you're interested in finding more about Escoffier, that is ESCOFFIER.edu. My contact information through Escoffier is on the website under the Chef Instructors tab. We have all of our bios there. They're amazing faculty members and many other folks beyond me that make the magic happen there. So if you ever want to contact any one of them, I'm sure they'd be happy to. Outside of that, for me personally, I am on Instagram. It's Dr. Chefany. So it's pretty easy to find me on Instagram. But Escoffier is definitely probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. I've got my email and work number there. So, but I'm always happy to hear from anybody, whether or not you're just dabbling into plant-based or if, you're trying to make this your life's pursuit. Wherever you are on your journey, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Well, it was great to have you on the show. I'm so happy that you were on to kick off the season. And really, I hope some of the tips will help our audience.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, and I do hope the tips help. And like I said, if people need more tips, I'm always around to help.
Thank you. I hope you found this episode helpful. Please share, rate, leave a review, and follow Plant-Based Diet on your favorite podcast listening platform and on the Alternative Food Network YouTube channel, where you can also find recipe videos. If you're on social media, please follow us on Instagram at Alternative Food Network. We also publish a monthly newsletter that includes plant-based recipes, our latest podcasts, and the occasional giveaway. You can sign up by going on our website at alternativefoodnetwork.com and click the newsletter sign up button. Until next time, thanks for listening. All content provided or opinions expressed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and are not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please seek advice from your doctor or other qualified healthcare practitioner.
Every idea starts with a problem. Warby Parker's was simple. Glasses are too expensive. So they set out to change that. By designing glasses in-house and selling directly to customers, they're able to offer prescription eyewear that's expertly crafted and unexpectedly affordable. Warby Parker glasses are made from premium materials like impact-resistant polycarbonate and custom acetate. And they start at just $95, including prescription lenses. Get glasses made from the good stuff. Stop by a Warby Parker store near you.